In a congressional showdown seen by over 43 million viewers, Jasmine Crockett shattered the facade of medical freedom and exposed a deadly truth. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., once hailed as a visionary, was accused of authorizing secret drug trials on poor black communities, trials that ended in tragedy. One contract, one photo, and one witness ignited a scandal that shook the nation. The system cracked. The world watched. But how many more trials lie buried, and who will dare to uncover them? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber lights burned hot. Every camera was live. Across the country, Americans leaned in to watch what had been promoted as a simple hearing. Just another session on personal freedom and public health. But this one was different. This one was branded across every news crawl in red letters. Live nationwide hearing, medical ethics and personal freedom. And inside the Capitol, the silence was taut. The kind of silence that feels like it's waiting to break. And then he entered. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. walked in like a man stepping onto a victory stage. His white suit was spotless, shining under the overhead lights. He didn't smile. He smirked. Aides flanked him, the press buzzed, and the GOP side of the chamber straightened with pride. They called him the pioneer of health freedom, and today he looked every bit the role. At the back of the room, no cameras turned. Jasmine Crockett sat still, near the exit, far from the microphones. No applause, no chatter. She didn't shift, didn't blink. Her presence was a whisper against the roar. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Resting on her lap was a thick black folder. The label on top screamed in red, "Classified, internal use only." The edges were worn. The spine cracked. Her fingers gripped it lightly, like someone holding a detonator, not a document. Then came the camera sweep. A slow, casual pan caught her face. She didn't look at the lens. She looked at him. Her eyes were sharp, cold, deliberate. Jasmine hadn't spoken a single word, but in that one stare, the whole chamber felt it. Something was coming, something none of them were ready for. And just like that, the storm opened its mouth, and Kennedy walked straight into it like he owned the thunder. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't need it. He leaned forward, both hands gripping the edge of the witness table, and stared down the room like it was already on his side. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice low but rising with deliberate force. "We've torn down the barriers that have suffocated innovation for decades." The line dropped like a match in dry grass. He paused, letting the words simmer. No more bureaucratic red tape. No more unelected officials deciding what's best for your body. His tone wasn't defensive. It was triumphant, like someone declaring a war already won. The effect was instant. Heads on the Republican side began to nod with synchronized approval. You could feel the tension shift, like the room had been rigged to cheer on cue. Kennedy straightened his shoulders, confidence radiating through every word. He was polished, proud, performing. But what came next wasn't a line. It was a weapon he'd been waiting to use. "Mandatory vaccines?" he said louder now, voice sharpened for impact. "That's not medicine. That's collective coercion." A single second of silence, and then the room detonated. Chairs scraped, hands clapped. One congressman stood and shouted, "That's right," before pounding the table with both fists. It was no longer a hearing. It was a standing ovation in slow motion. Some aides grinned at each other. Some reporters typed furiously, already crafting headlines. Kennedy didn't flinch. He just held the line, arms loose at his side like a victorious fighter waiting for the bell. To the GOP flank, he was a hero delivering truth in real time. Their champion had just thrown the first punch. But at the far end of the chamber, untouched by the frenzy, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She sat perfectly upright, shoulders relaxed, pen in hand. Her head tilted just slightly, eyes never leaving Kennedy's face. While the noise swelled, her world went quiet. She wasn't watching a hero. She was studying a defendant. Every word he spoke was being measured, dissected, cataloged. Her pen worked without pause. Names, references, contradictions, timestamps. While others stood in celebration, she carved through noise like a scalpel through silk. He didn't look at her. Not yet. He was still swimming in the applause, believing the heat on his skin came from victory. But Jasmine's silence wasn't surrender. It was the sound before a wire snaps, and she never took her eyes off the fuse. But the noise didn't last long, because Jasmine finally reached for the mic. No sound accompanied her motion, no preamble, no warning. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, pressing the button like someone activating a trigger. A soft green light blinked on. The applause died almost on instinct, as if the room itself understood something had shifted. She leaned forward, not in anger, not in defiance, but with the cool composure of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. Her voice broke the silence like a scalpel through skin. "Secretary," she said evenly, "do you recall a project called Immunobridge in Houston, Texas?" No one moved. Kennedy blinked. The line hit him harder than expected. He tilted his head slightly, smile still clinging to his face, but it had lost its shine. "I'm not directly familiar with every initiative under the department," he began, but the words came out too quickly, too defensive. The confidence in his voice cracked. Something had pierced his rhythm, and everyone in the room could hear it. Jasmine didn't blink. She flipped open the black folder with surgical precision, a thin rustle of paper. No drama, just facts. "It was a community-based medical pilot," she continued, her tone steady, her eyes fixed on him like she was reading his pulse. "Low-income zip codes, 85% Black and Hispanic residents." The facts were bullets, and she was firing them one by one. "Two are dead." The words landed like a gavel. A heavy silence descended across the chamber. No reporters typed. No aides whispered. Even the camera crews froze, holding their breath behind their lenses. Kennedy looked stunned. Not outraged, not dismissive. Just off balance. And that's when Jasmine delivered the second incision. "Both died within 48 hours of what your team labeled voluntary therapeutic exposure." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every syllable carried the weight of loss, injustice, and evidence. This wasn't outreach. This was experimentation. There was no emotion in her voice. That made it worse. She wasn't making an argument. She was stating a fact. And it rang louder than any speech in the room. Kennedy shifted in his seat. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His hands fidgeted beneath the table. The camera zoomed in, catching the tremble in his fingers. Then Jasmine pulled out the final piece, coolly, methodically. She slid a document across the surface. It looked simple, just paper. But the way she placed it down made it feel like a weapon. Her voice didn't change. "Here's the funding agreement." She tapped the bottom corner with the tip of her pen. "Page 1, digital signature, RF, Kennedy silence. Complete suffocating silence." The applause was gone. The swagger evaporated. Even the light seemed dimmer now. Every eye in the chamber turned to Kennedy. But Jasmine didn't. She just sat there, pen in hand, folder open, waiting for the truth to finish echoing. And in that moment, the hearing changed. Not with shouting, not with fury, with precision. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She was just getting started. She reached down without breaking eye contact, her fingers finding a new sheet in the folder, thinner than the last one, but heavier in meaning. This wasn't a contract. This was a confession. She held it up between two fingers, not to show off, but to make sure the cameras had a clear shot. Her voice was low, measured, surgical. "This," she said, "is an internal communication from your assistant to the Immunobridge research team." She didn't wait. She read the line straight from the page. "We need to accelerate the test group due to racially compatible demographics." The room didn't just go quiet. It recoiled. Several lawmakers visibly stiffened. A reporter's pen stopped mid-sentence. Somewhere near the front row, a staffer whispered, "Oh my God," under their breath. No one looked at Kennedy. They were all watching Jasmine now. Watching the moment she drew blood. She continued, eyes locked on her target. "This message was sent 6 days before field testing began in Houston, and it was copied directly to your lead coordinator overseeing the deployment phase." Then, without blinking, she flipped to the second page. "Attached to that thread, an internal project brief confirming that the immunological compound in use had not passed phase 2 trials. She paused just long enough to let the words burn. The treatment in question had not been cleared by an FDA review board. No external ethics body signed off. No independent safety assessment conducted. And yet, she tapped the margin, your office pushed forward anyway. Kennedy shifted in his seat, his hands clenched. His expression, composed just minutes ago, was now cracked around the edges. And then Jasmine spoke the line that shattered whatever was left of his defense. This email proves you knew the drug had not been approved by the FDA. For one long second, he didn't move. Then came the stumble. I wasn't managing that project directly, he muttered, his voice suddenly smaller. I wasn't aware of every communication. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't even a deflection. It was the sound of a man reaching for a railing in a room with no walls, and around him the chamber began to shift. A Republican senator leaned to whisper into his aide's ear. Another scribbled furiously on a notepad. You could feel the pressure inside the room changing, like something that had once been airtight was now losing control. The people who had clapped minutes ago were now whispering behind their hands, eyes darting, lips sealed. But Jasmine didn't move. She sat still, hands folded, documents placed neatly in front of her like evidence on a courtroom table. Her silence wasn't passive, it was loaded, because she knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the next incision, and just when the room thought it couldn't sink any deeper. Jasmine dropped the receipts. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She reached into the folder again, slow and controlled, like someone about to lay evidence on a murder table. Her hand came back with 3 crisp sheets, each one marked, tabbed, and underlined with clinical precision. She didn't slam them down. She didn't grandstand. She simply slid the first one into the center of the table like a poker chip in a final deadly hand. Here's a wire transfer for $1.2 million, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a clean blade. From a private account linked to your cousin, Brian Kennedy. She tapped the corner. The recipient? One of the Houston contractors tied directly to the field testing unit. You could almost feel the tension exhale from the walls. She didn't need to say the word nepotism. The connection was already written in neon ink across every face in the room. Jasmine leaned in a little closer, eyes locked on Kennedy, unblinking. Same last name, same trust fund, same money trail. The implication wasn't just financial, it was personal. She was slicing through bloodlines now, and doing it with receipts. She moved to the second page, a shift so seamless it felt rehearsed. This, she said, lifting the paper between her fingers, is the CDC's review summary of the compound used in Immunobridge. Her finger didn't hesitate. It landed precisely on a red highlighted sentence. It states, no third-party verification, no independent toxicology, no cross-population trial conducted prior to field application. She lowered the paper and stared directly at him. So while your team called it a breakthrough, she paused. The CDC called it unverified. The silence in the room grew heavier, thicker. You could see lawmakers begin to lean forward, some instinctively reaching for the documents in front of them, unsure if they were still in the audience or already part of the case. Jasmine hadn't changed tone once. She hadn't yelled. But somehow the room now felt like a courtroom, and Kennedy was sitting in the defendant's chair. Then came the third document, the one that didn't need legal jargon. She lifted it gently, paper thin, but it hit the table like a thunderclap. And this, she said softly, is the death certificate. Gasps didn't erupt. They cracked inward, silent, gut level. Jasmine didn't dramatize it. She held the page between 2 fingers, like it might burn. One of the 2 deceased, she said quietly, age 47, African American, died within 48 hours of administration. She looked up from the page and locked eyes with Kennedy, calm, cold, devastating. Cause of death listed here. She read it clearly without emphasis. Acute immune response failure. That was it. That was the floor caving in. No one dared to breathe too loudly. One camera operator actually lowered his lens. Aides froze mid-keystroke. Even the GOP bench, just 20 minutes ago alive with applause, now sat in statuesque silence. No defense came from Kennedy, no interruption. His hands were folded tightly, eyes fixed on the documents like they might dissolve if he stared hard enough. But they didn't. They just sat there. 3 sheets of paper, a money trail, a CDC warning, a death certificate, and the woman who dropped them didn't blink once. And that's when Kennedy snapped. His composure didn't fade. It shattered. With a sudden burst of fury, he slammed his hand on the table, the sound of flesh against wood echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. Several aides flinched. A camera jerked off focus. Even the chairman leaned back. Kennedy's face was flushed, his jaw locked tight, eyes burning not with clarity, but with panic barely disguised as rage. "You're exploiting a tragedy to smear my name," he shouted, voice rising with every word. "You are twisting an unfortunate incident for political gain." He wasn't just angry, he was cornered, and everyone could feel it. His voice didn't shake. It roared, but the strength behind it felt hollow, like a wall built too fast and already cracking. His fists clenched as he leaned forward, trying to reclaim the power he had walked in with. But the momentum was gone. The clapping from earlier, erased. The smirks, vanished. What was left now was a man yelling not to be heard, but not to drown. Jasmine didn't even blink. She sat still, completely still, as if his explosion hadn't touched the air around her. There was no flinch, no reaction, no rise in tone, just the calm, controlled silence of someone who had predicted this moment long before it arrived. She didn't raise her voice, not even by a decibel, but when she spoke, it sliced through the tension like a scalpel through fabric. "You talk about medical freedom, but you never say who pays the price for it." The line didn't echo. It landed, hard. The words dropped like a stone into deep water, silent at first, but impossible to ignore. Every head in the room turned, not toward Jasmine, but back to Kennedy. Faces that had once beamed with loyalty now showed something colder. Distance. One senator lowered his pen. A Republican aide stopped typing and stared straight ahead. The oxygen in the chamber didn't disappear, but it stopped moving. The volume didn't fall, it collapsed. And in that sudden quiet, the hierarchy shifted. Kennedy was still at the table, but he wasn't in charge of it anymore. The spotlight that once warmed him now exposed him. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. He wasn't arguing now. He was absorbing, reacting, bleeding in real time. The moment didn't belong to his rage. It belonged to her truth, and the silence that followed it. But the silence didn't just sit there. It started to break people open. A black congressman sitting near the front leaned forward and covered his mouth. His shoulders tensed, and he looked like he was fighting to keep it together. 2 rows down, a congresswoman stared blankly at the desk in front of her, eyes filling with tears that she didn't wipe away. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her silence said everything. One aide off to the side wiped his face quickly, hoping no one noticed. But everyone noticed. Then came the list. Jasmine didn't announce it. She didn't even look up. A staffer stepped forward and started passing out copies, thick packets, printed and stapled. No drama, just the facts. The front page read, "Test Zone Target List, Phase 1. Underneath were rows of zip codes, neighborhoods, schools, and the racial makeup of each. It was clean, cold, and exact. One congressman held the packet in his hand and stopped flipping after the second page. Another looked down and quietly whispered, "No, no, that's my block." A third sat frozen. He didn't say a word. He just stared at a zip code he recognized. It spread quickly. People in the room weren't looking at statistics. They were looking at their homes, their families, the same streets where they'd grown up, where they still lived. "That's where my grandmother lives," someone muttered. "That's my district." The fear was building, but it wasn't the kind that makes people scream. It was the kind that makes them realize something terrible had already happened, and no one told them. Kennedy was still in his seat, but now he wasn't saying much. His hands kept moving, fingers twitching, nails tapping the table. His eyes darted left, then down, then back at the paper in front of him. For a moment it looked like he might try to speak. Then he did. "That list doesn't represent confirmed locations," he said quietly. "Some of those zones were just part of early analysis. But his voice didn't sound sure, not even close. And the room didn't respond. No one nodded. No one even moved. Because the more he talked, the more people stopped believing. Then Jasmine leaned forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't show anger. But there was a weight in her tone that made every word hit like a punch. We are not lab rats, but in your eyes, our skin color was a permission slip for experimentation. The whole room froze. No one made a sound. Even the reporter stopped typing. One camera zoomed in without being told to. No one coughed. No one shifted. Even the lights seemed quieter. That line, just one sentence, cut through everything. No yelling. No drama. Just truth, laid bare for the whole country to hear. And Jasmine didn't follow it up with anything else. She didn't need to, because in that moment, everyone understood. The silence wasn't just about shock, it was about shame. And Kennedy had nothing left to say. But Jasmine wasn't done. She had one more cut to make, and this one was personal. The folder on her desk had been nearly emptied, but there was still one thing left. Something she hadn't touched until now. Jasmine reached inside, not hurriedly, not dramatically, but with a calm that made the moment feel heavier than anything that had come before. What she pulled out wasn't thick or stamped or classified. It was a photograph. She held it in her hand for a long second, just looking at it. Then, without saying a word, she stood up. Her chair didn't scrape. Her movement didn't startle. But the energy in the room changed instantly. Every head turned. Every camera refocused. Even Kennedy, exhausted and hunched, lifted his eyes just enough to register that something new was about to land. Jasmine held the photo up, slowly and steadily, turning it toward the chamber so everyone could see. No text, no caption, just the face of a young woman, maybe 22, smiling brightly at the camera. Malia. The name wasn't on the photo, but it didn't need to be. Jasmine's silence gave it weight. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for attention. It demands it. And then she spoke. Not loud, not theatrical, just clean, clear, and devastating. If this were your niece, would you have let them inject her with an unapproved drug? The words didn't echo. They stopped time. A sharp intake of breath could be heard from somewhere in the back. No one else made a sound. Not a pen drop. Not a chair shift. It wasn't just quiet. It was absolute stillness. Her question didn't go to a committee. It didn't request data or defense. It tore right into the man sitting across from her and asked him to answer. Not as a politician, not as a Kennedy, but as a human being. Kennedy didn't speak. He didn't try to pivot or lash out like he had before. He just sat there. His eyes fell from Jasmine's face to the photo in her hand and didn't rise again. His shoulders slumped inward. His chin dipped slightly toward his chest. His fingers gripped the edge of the table like it might keep him upright. But there was no hiding what had just happened. For the first time that morning, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. looked smaller than the chair he sat in. He lowered his head, and in that motion, without a single word, the room saw what it needed to see. He had no answer. The power dynamics shattered. The myth cracked. Even the cameras, still rolling, seemed reluctant to zoom in too close. Because what they were witnessing wasn't a confrontation anymore. It was a collapse. Not a man unraveling with rage, but unraveling from the truth. A truth too personal to spin, too real to dodge. And Jasmine? She didn't speak again. She stood there holding the photo like a quiet verdict, letting the silence do what words no longer needed to do. She didn't gloat. She didn't blink. She just waited. Because this moment wasn't about her. It was about a question that exposed everything, and a room that couldn't breathe under the weight of it. Then, like a man choking on silence, Kennedy exploded. The weight of Jasmine's question hadn't left the room, but he tried to bury it with volume. He shoved himself forward in his seat, both hands slamming against the desk hard enough to rattle the microphone. His voice came out, fast, raw, and cracking at the edges. "This is a smear campaign," he shouted, eyes scanning the crowd for support that didn't answer. "A full-blown political ambush orchestrated by the Democratic Party." His hand shot out, pointing straight at Jasmine, shaking with rage. "You're exploiting grief, manipulating public emotion to turn this hearing into a media circus. His words were sharp, but his delivery was frantic, not focused. He was no longer speaking to convince. He was speaking to survive. Each sentence landed like a punch thrown without aim. Hard, fast, desperate. But the room didn't react the way he wanted. There were no murmurs of agreement, no reflexive nods from his allies, no applause from the Republican side. The same people who had cheered his entrance now stared with heavy silence. A senator looked down. A staffer slowly put away his pen. Kennedy's voice filled the chamber, but it wasn't filling hearts anymore. It was just bouncing off walls. He fumbled through a binder beside him, yanking out a stack of printed slides. Edges bent, tabs barely holding. According to WHO records, he said, his voice straining to regain its authority, this project was under strict international supervision. He lifted one page, then another, holding them up like they were shields. Every phase had oversight. Every dosage was within protocol. He waved a color-coded graph in the air, red, blue, yellow, but the paper trembled between his fingers. That was what the cameras caught, not the data, not the graphs, but the trembling hands of a man unraveling in front of the country. Kennedy's voice kept rising. We followed every rule, every global health standard, but even he seemed to hear it now. The way his voice wavered, the way no one interrupted him because no one felt the need. He wasn't commanding attention, he was drowning in it. Jasmine didn't say a word. She sat still, expression unreadable, arms resting on the folder that had already buried his defense. And the silence around her grew louder with every sentence he spoke. Because what once was certainty now smelled like panic. The louder Kennedy tried to fight, the more obvious it became. His defense wasn't landing. It was slipping. The evidence still sat on the table. The photo of Malia was still burned into everyone's memory. And no statistic, no chart, no global stamp of approval could wash that away. The chamber no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the questions he couldn't answer, and the witnesses he couldn't silence. And the room knew it, because applause doesn't return after a moment like that. But suspicion stays. And suspicion doesn't need to speak. It just watches while power collapses in plain view. And just when Kennedy thought it couldn't get worse, Jasmine called her final witness. She leaned forward into the mic, voice calm, composed, but with an edge that told the room something irreversible was about to happen. Mr. Eric Whitmore, she said. That was all. No build-up, no explanation, just a name. The double doors at the rear of the chamber opened with a soft creak. A man stepped through, shoulders tense, lips pressed tight, every step measured like he was walking into a courtroom, not a hearing. He wore no suit, just a plain navy shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearms, the look of someone who'd carried something too heavy for too long. He didn't walk like someone defending a side. He walked like someone finally done with hiding. He sat down at the witness chair beside Jasmine. The room didn't breathe. Cameras refocused. Lawmakers leaned in. Even the reporters stopped typing. Jasmine turned to him gently. Please state your name for the record. He nodded once, eyes forward. My name is Eric Whitmore. I was a biomedical systems engineer on the Immunobridge deployment team. The silence deepened. All eyes slowly shifted toward Kennedy. The man's jaw tensed. His body was still, but his face had lost color. For the first time in the entire hearing, Kennedy didn't interrupt. He didn't prepare rebuttals or flip through paper. He just stared. Eric leaned closer to the microphone, hands clasped together so tightly the skin around his knuckles had gone white. We knew the drug wasn't fully tested, he said. We knew it wasn't ready. The air snapped. No one gasped this time, but you could feel the shock ripple like electricity. Jasmine didn't blink. Kennedy didn't move. Lawmakers exchanged looks with each other like something sacred had just been cracked open. This wasn't speculation. It wasn't accusation. It was confirmation. From the inside. Eric's voice stayed low, but each word felt heavier. We were told to stay quiet, told the public wouldn't understand, that speaking up would cause chaos, that the rollout would settle itself. His eyes drifted down to the table, then back to the lawmakers. We were told testing quietly was the safest route for everyone. Then came the line that broke the room. His voice cracked, not loudly, not for show, but just enough to feel real, just enough to sound like a man finally admitting to something that had eaten him alive for months. "I betrayed their trust," he said. "I failed them. I failed all of them." The weight of that confession hit like a hammer. Somebody at the back of the chamber whispered, "Jesus," under their breath. A congresswoman brought a hand to her chest, her eyes locked on him with stunned disbelief. Aide after aide lowered their heads. Even the cameras hesitated, uncertain whether to zoom in or give the man space to breathe. Kennedy sat frozen. His lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no sound came out. His hands were still. Not because they had calmed, but because they were clenched into fists under the table, shaking with pressure he could no longer release. There was no rebuttal, no outrage, no charts, no press releases. Just a single man, once inside the room where it happened, saying what no one wanted to believe, but now couldn't ignore. And Jasmine, she didn't interrupt. She didn't even look at Kennedy. She just kept her eyes on the witness and let the truth speak for itself. By the time Eric Whitmore stepped down, the hearing wasn't just a political disaster. It was a full-blown national collapse. It began like a dam breaking. 1 minute, the room was still echoing from Eric Whitmore's final words. The next, every major news network exploded into action. Fox News cut its regular broadcast with a red banner. CNN dropped a scheduled segment. MSNBC rolled a full special report within seconds. Anchors stared into cameras with pale faces, repeating fragments as if confirming them to themselves. A government engineer just testified they knew the drug wasn't ready. The moment wasn't a broadcast. It was a bomb. Jasmine's line, "Would you inject her if she were your niece?" was replayed on an endless loop across networks. Eric's voice, shaking, broken, became the voice of guilt across a nation. His final words echoed louder than any headline. "I betrayed their trust." Within hours, the political temperature skyrocketed. Civil rights leaders demanded answers. The Southern Poverty Law Center declared it a breach of human dignity. Medical associations called for a review of all experimental protocols issued under Kennedy's tenure. Advocacy groups from both liberal and conservative sides aligned in rare unity. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was about trust, and it had been shattered. By nightfall, America wasn't just angry, it was moving. In Washington, D.C., thousands gathered outside the Capitol. Candlelight flickered in tense silence before chants erupted. Signs shot above heads, showing faces of children, elderly patients, and grieving families. In New York, a group of pediatricians marched from Bellevue Hospital to the steps of City Hall. In Atlanta, entire blocks were shut down by protesters demanding federal action. It wasn't chaos. It was clarity. Millions of Americans finally seeing what had been hidden. At 11:53 p.m., the first nationwide address dropped. The Department of Justice confirmed it had opened an emergency criminal investigation into the Immunobridge program. The language was unambiguous. In light of testimony provided under oath and upon review of preliminary documentation, a full-scale federal probe is now underway. It wasn't just political anymore. It was prosecutorial. The system had been rattled, and now it was fighting to prove it could still hold someone accountable. Overnight, Kennedy's allies started vanishing. Senators who once praised him issued late-night statements claiming they had no idea about the cover-up. 2 Republican governors distanced themselves entirely, calling for independent oversight. One former aide leaked a memo dated 6 months earlier with the words, "Hold the line. Optics matter more than testing." That line alone showed the intent, and intent meant liability. By dawn, it wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a constitutional emergency. The president, cornered by reporters on the South Lawn, gave a 6-word answer that hit every newsroom like an earthquake. Yes, the Attorney General is involved. And just like that, the fire Jasmine had started in that room spread across the entire country. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. Real streets, real resignations, real lives. And it wasn't finished yet. As the nation exploded outside, inside the halls of Congress, one man wasn't collapsing, he was calculating. The marble floors of the Capitol had seen scandal before, but nothing like this. just hours after the engineering testimony shook the country and sent shockwaves through every news channel. Senator John Kennedy made his next move. With blood in the water and headlines screaming for justice, he didn't flinch. He walked into the rotunda with his head held high and delivered a single deliberate statement to a crowd of hungry reporters. In order to not interfere with the investigation, I will take a temporary leave of absence. That was it. No remorse, no apology, and absolutely no mention of stepping down. It was a surgical strike, politically precise and emotionally void. He called it respect for the process, but to the world watching, it was defiance wrapped in protocol. The cameras didn't miss the way his lips curled when he left the mic, nor how his staff moved like a phalanx, shielding him from follow-up questions. Kennedy wasn't retreating. He was buying time. Behind the scenes, the game had already started. While protesters filled the streets, Kennedy activated every back channel he had built over decades in Washington. He called in favors that hadn't been spoken aloud in 10 years. He met with old friends, lobbyists, strategists, GOP loyalists, one by one, over steak dinners, backroom meetings, and encrypted phone lines. Every conversation began with the same line. We can't let this take us all down. The pitch wasn't legal, it was tribal. If I fall, others fall with me. And for some, that was enough. Several Republican representatives, some with skeletons of their own, stepped up immediately. By morning, the right-wing press had been seeded with talking points. Phrases like media hysteria, weaponized emotion, and premature judgment began echoing across panels on Fox and Newsmax. Behind the curtain, Kennedy's machine was running hot, but the public was boiling hotter. Then came the leak. It started as a whisper among Hill staffers. A private meeting, Georgetown, wine, envelopes. But whispers in Washington don't stay whispers for long. 3 reporters at Politico, CNN, and ProPublica received the same message within 30 minutes. Attached was an internal calendar screenshot showing Kennedy's name next to 6 major pharmaceutical donors, some of whom were already under scrutiny in the investigation. The meeting had happened just 2 nights earlier, far from Capitol cameras. No official notes, no public disclosure. Only one direct quote from an aide who was in the room, scribbled hastily on a napkin. "Help me hold the line. I'll protect your investments." That quote detonated across media like a landmine. By lunchtime, it was already being read on the House floor. One Democrat slammed it on the podium and roared, "Protect investments? While kids die from rushed trials? This isn't defense. It's disgrace." Even some centrist Republicans were caught wincing in the background. Kennedy's camp issued a short denial, claiming the quote was mischaracterized. But the damage was done. The illusion of strategy turned into the stench of desperation. The House struck back. Within hours of the leak, a special ethics subcommittee was formed. Staffers worked overnight. Lights inside the Rayburn building burned past midnight. By dawn, a draft outline of articles of impeachment was quietly circulating among Democratic leadership. The language was sharp and deadly: abuse of public trust, manipulation of public health resources for political gain, active obstruction of transparency and safety regulation. Jasmine Crockett, still riding the momentum of her historic confrontation, was reportedly one of the key voices pressing for immediate action. "This isn't personal," she told colleagues in a closed-door session. "This is national accountability." The silence in that room, according to one aide, was thunderous. The Judiciary Committee was now divided. Sparks flew in closed meetings, chairs banged, fists slammed into wood. And still, Kennedy didn't blink. He wasn't done playing. Though banned from public hearings during his temporary leave, Kennedy quietly hosted private discussions in his Senate office, which remained open for constituent matters. But few constituents walked through those doors. Instead, it was strategy teams, legal consultants, and spin doctors. A key strategy emerged: fracture the opposition before they unite. One report confirmed that Kennedy attempted to sway several moderate Democrats from swing districts, offering them subtle suggestions about re-election support should they choose to slow the process. None took the bait, but the attempt was noted and leaked. Publicly, Kennedy said nothing. Privately, he was everywhere. And yet the walls were shifting. His once loyal inner circle began pulling away. One staffer, after 8 years by his side, resigned and released a blistering letter online. I believed in public service, but I can't serve power that puts donors above lives. The letter went viral. That night, Kennedy's office lights stayed on till nearly 3 a.m. Cameras caught him exiting, alone. Briefcase in hand, tie loosened. A reporter yelled, "Do you still believe you'll keep your seat, Senator?" He didn't answer, but his jaw tightened like concrete. The following morning, cable news exploded again. CNN ran a full-hour special. Collapse of a senator. MSNBC brought in constitutional lawyers to discuss impeachment timing. Even Fox News was divided. Some hosts defending him, others saying, "This looks worse by the hour." Outside his district office in Louisiana, a crowd had gathered. Not huge, but loud. One protester held a sign, "Temporary leave, try permanent removal." The message was clear. Kennedy wasn't gone, but he wasn't safe. He was boxed in, surrounded on all sides by reporters, lawmakers, staff, donors, in a furious public demanding blood. Every move he made was watched. Every silence he gave was dissected. Every day he stayed in office fed the flames. He still wore the suit, still gave the nod, still barked orders behind closed doors. But even lions bleed when the herd turns. Kennedy hadn't fallen, not yet, but the empire he built was cracking, and every crack was loud. And just when the storm looked ready to swallow everything, Jasmine Crockett stepped into the fire and spoke like the system owed her silence, but she refused to pay. The press room wasn't built for moments like this. It was too small, too polished, too rehearsed. But that morning, it felt like a stage carved from chaos. The room buzzed like a live wire. Every seat was taken. Cameramen whispered over lenses. Reporters gripped their notepads like they were shields. Everyone knew something was coming, but no one expected the blast to hit that fast, that sharp. Jasmine Crockett walked in with no entourage, no teleprompter, no script. Just a folder in her left hand and fury under her skin. She didn't shake hands. She didn't smile. She stepped behind the podium, looked every journalist in the eye, and tore through the room with just 13 words. "We cannot call this a health policy when it kills the poor." No one breathed. Her voice didn't waver. It cracked through the silence like a judge's gavel. For a half second, even the flashes stopped. Then they returned in a frenzy. Shutters clicked like machine guns. Pens scrambled to catch up. But Jasmine didn't stop. "The freedom they brag about means nothing," she continued, her eyes burning, "if it's built on the backs of dead Black Americans." Gasps spread across the crowd. A few reporters looked up, startled. Others leaned in closer. One woman from Reuters whispered, "That's the quote. That's the quote." But Jasmine wasn't talking for headlines. She was talking for graves, for broken families, for names buried in reports that never made it past footnotes. She had seen too many victims turned into statistics. Today, she was naming the system out loud. She dropped the folder on the podium with a loud thud. Inside were printed pages, the very same engineering testimony from the hearing, inspection photos of untested ventilation systems, budget memos redacted so sloppily you could still read the names underneath. She didn't hold it up for effect. She didn't need to. The weight of it hit harder than any stunt. "This isn't about a disagreement in policy," she said, now raising her voice. "This is about greed dressed as governance. And I don't care who doesn't like hearing that." C-SPAN's feed lit up. CNN cut in mid-segment. Twitter exploded before she even left the mic. Then came the moment no one was ready for. She turned to the cameras, leaned slightly forward, and lowered her tone. Not soft, but surgical. "If this system is comfortable letting the poor die quietly, then I will not stay quiet." The room froze again. One Fox News anchor in the back shifted uncomfortably. An NPR reporter scribbled the quote 3 times. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She never once looked down at her notes. Because there were no notes. She wasn't testifying. She was testifying. In the hours that followed, her words spread like wildfire. "We cannot call this a health policy when it kills the poor." The freedom they brag about means nothing if it's built on the backs of dead Black Americans. Those lines hit every newspaper headline from D.C. to Des Moines. The New York Times ran it across 3 columns. The Washington Post printed her full quote, unedited. The L.A. Times used it as a banner across their opinion page. Even The Hill, usually cautious in tone, ran the title, Crockett's Cry, Justice Doesn't Need Permission to Speak. Late-night hosts opened with it. Podcasters dissected it. Academics quoted it in real time. And on the street, it wasn't just politics anymore. It was personal. Protesters began holding signs with her words scrawled across cardboard and canvas. One massive banner stretched across the Capitol fence read, "This is not health care. It's homicide for profit." Another, seen in downtown Atlanta. "They kill us in bills before they kill us in beds." Every city, every state, someone had printed the words. Even churches started quoting her in Sunday sermons. Her voice, once confined to hearings and committee rooms, had broken loose. It was now gospel on the streets. In the middle of it all, one tweet changed the game. A retired nurse from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a Black woman in her 70s, posted a photo of herself holding a candle with the caption, "I watched my nephew die because of a policy they called cost-effective. Jasmine, you spoke for him today." The post went viral in 3 hours. Over 1 million likes, hundreds of thousands of shares. The comments section filled with names. Each one a story, each one a loss. The phrase began to stick. Jasmine Crockett, the torch of justice in the tech age. The nickname didn't come from her campaign. It came from people, from survivors, from witnesses, from grandmothers who had buried children and children who had buried parents. Torch of Justice wasn't branding. It was a title earned in blood and boldness. College students began printing t-shirts. Street artists painted murals in Dallas and Oakland. Someone even designed a filter with her quote, "Across your camera lens. Say it like Jasmine." One protester in Brooklyn was filmed shouting through a megaphone, "If they light the fuse, she brings the fire." And somehow, in a world addicted to digital chaos, one woman had made a real fire go viral. But behind the roar, Jasmine remained grounded. That evening, she sat in her office alone, watching the footage. Her chief of staff knocked, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on the screen, not at herself, but at the crowd outside. The chants, the signs, the fury that had finally found a voice. She whispered softly, "They finally heard us. Not me. United States." Because for her, this wasn't about being the face of a movement. It was about cracking the concrete that had silenced too many voices for too long. The White House, sensing the shift, held an emergency health task force meeting by midnight. The Department of Health and Human Services requested a full review of the inspection protocols. Even the Surgeon General posted a vague but telling message on X. Systemic failures cannot be corrected with silence. Political consultants were panicking. Lobbyists scrambled to pull records. Kennedy's former donors started going dark, some even issuing denials that they had ever met the senator personally. The tide was turning, not gently, but violently. And Jasmine? She kept walking forward. She declined every network interview that night. She didn't celebrate. She didn't pose. She went home, hugged her dog, and sat quietly on her porch under the Texas sky. The fire wasn't over, but for once it was visible, and the woman who lit it was no longer alone in the dark. But the real explosion didn't end with the cameras. It started with what came next. When the dust settled, something wild happened. Jasmine Crockett, the congresswoman they tried to humiliate, became the face they couldn't ignore. She wasn't just trending, she was transforming. Invitations poured in. College campuses, labor halls, community centers, even cathedrals. People weren't asking for her opinion anymore. They were begging for her truth. Everywhere she went, it was the same. Standing room, only crowds, lines down the block, people holding signs with her quotes scrawled in Sharpie like scripture. They didn't want speeches. They wanted fire. And Jasmine brought it every single time. At a rally in Detroit, she stood on stage and didn't wait for applause. She pointed to a photo of 2 children, the same ones from the leaked report, and asked one raw question: if these were your babies, would silence still feel safe? The crowd didn't cheer. They roared. An old veteran took off his cap and held it to his chest. A young woman in the front sobbed into her phone while live streaming. In Philadelphia, she told the story of a janitor who died after being forced to test a prototype machine in a basement without airflow. No badge, no name tag, just a number in a file. That is what silence does. That line would go viral within minutes. People weren't just quoting her. They were carrying her words into protests, into schools, into courtrooms. She wasn't trying to be a symbol, but the people had already made her one. Colleges called her the new Angela Davis with fire in her lungs. Activists in Chicago painted a mural of her in front of the same community clinic where one of the victims had been denied care. Teenagers in Oakland printed shirts with her face and the words, "Say it before they erase it." Jasmine didn't dodge the spotlight, but she didn't chase it either. She walked into it like a funeral, slow, steady, and knowing the price. Because she knew something the cameras didn't. This wasn't fame. This was grief wearing armor. The mothers of the two victims, their pain never left the room. When Jasmine spoke at a vigil in Houston, she didn't take center stage. She stood to the side while the families lit candles. The mother of one child clutched the microphone and whispered, "I just want someone to admit he mattered." Jasmine didn't interrupt. She knelt beside her and held her hand, letting the silence scream. Later that night at a press conference, a reporter asked Jasmine if she believed justice had been served. Her voice was steady. "Justice isn't a press release. Justice is a system that doesn't need us to die first." The crowd murmured. The microphones leaned closer. "Until that day," she said, "I'll keep naming the names they try to bury." The families began traveling too, not for cameras, not for headlines, but for truth. They weren't chasing lawsuits. They were chasing accountability. One father built a mobile billboard with his son's face on it, driving it state to state with the words, "You let him die, we won't let you forget." At one stop in Tulsa, a woman approached him in tears. She pulled a photo from her wallet. A cousin, same facility, same dates, same symptoms. She had never spoken about it. Now she couldn't stop. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. "I think they tested on him too." And just like that, the question spread. At first it was a whisper, then it turned into a national echo. Town halls brought it up, university panels dissected it, civil rights attorneys printed it across banners. But it always came back to the same chilling line. How many more experiments happened, and we never knew? That sentence showed up in classrooms, in court petitions, on graffiti walls. It didn't ask for answers, it demanded them. Because suddenly people started checking records. Nurses called whistleblower hotlines. Engineers released blueprints anonymously. Congressional aides leaked sealed emails that hinted at similar testing programs dating back years. Jasmine didn't claim to know everything, but she knew this. Every lie we uncover makes it harder for the next one to hide. She said that live on MSNBC, and the clip broke 1 million views in 4 hours. By the end of that month, 3 more facilities were flagged for internal audits. 2 CEOs quietly resigned. One senator announced he wouldn't seek re-election, citing family priorities, but no one bought it. The heat was rising and no one was safe from it anymore. The pressure reached Capitol Hill again. Jasmine was called back, this time not as a witness, but as a voice. A committee chair asked her to help draft new legislation on federal medical oversight. She accepted, but made one thing clear. "I'm not here to soften the language. I'm here to make sure this never happens again." Behind the scenes, it wasn't pretty. Lobbyists tried to water down the bill. Agencies pushed back. An internal memo even warned of public overreaction and advised that Jasmine be handled delicately. That memo leaked. It backfired. Jasmine read it aloud during a live interview, then looked straight into the camera and said, "They didn't handle the victims delicately. Don't ask me to sugarcoat the truth." The next day, donations poured into a new nonprofit she quietly launched. The Integrity Initiative, a watchdog group dedicated to exposing unethical testing from prisons to private labs. Within weeks, they had filed 6 FOIA requests and assembled a task force of volunteer researchers, many of them survivors or family members of victims. The movement had mutated. It was no longer reactive. It was proactive. Investigative teams traveled to forgotten towns with sealed files. Independent journalists teamed up with students. Churches hosted forums. The nation was wide awake. At a town hall in Birmingham, an elderly man stood up with trembling hands and asked, "Do you think this was the only time?" Jasmine didn't blink. She walked off the stage, took his hand and said, "No, I think it was the only one they got caught doing." The room erupted, not in cheers, but in cold, hard recognition. Because that was the moment people realized. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a pattern, and patterns don't stop on their own. Even international outlets picked it up. The BBC ran a special segment, American Experiments, Justice After the Leak. In France, Le Monde dubbed Jasmine La Voix du Refus, the voice of refusal. She wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She was a case study in how one voice, when armed with truth, could crack open an entire structure. But none of it came easy. She lost sleep, faced threats, received letters that began with, "Watch your step," and ended with no return address. One night, someone broke into her office and left a single piece of paper on her desk. No words, just a printed photo of the facility, a red X marked over it. She didn't flinch. She filed the report, she replaced her office locks, and the next morning she gave another speech. "If fear could stop me," she said, "they would have won a long time ago." By now, kids were dressing up as her for Halloween. Teachers assigned essays on her speeches. Barbershops argued over her quotes. Preachers built sermons around her lines. One pastor in Memphis said, "Moses parted the Red Sea, Jasmine parted the red tape." And still, through it all, the families kept going. They testified, they marched, they wrote op-eds. They never let anyone forget the names that started it all. 1 year later, a permanent memorial was installed in D.C. Two sculptures cast in steel of children holding hands, their eyes wide open. Beneath them, etched in stone. They were not numbers, they were warnings. And underneath that, in bolder print, how many more experiments happened? And we never knew? Of all the questions raised, one echoed loudest. What kind of country do we become if silence is easier than justice? In a world obsessed with quick headlines and even quicker distractions, this story didn't fade. It lingered. It pressed against people's hearts and made them sit with discomfort. Not because it was designed to shock, but because it was real. Jasmine's voice wasn't just a rebuttal in a hearing, it became a mirror. And millions saw more than a politician. They saw a woman who stood her ground in the lion's den and didn't flinch when power roared in her face. It made people ask themselves, what would I have done in her place? Her words were more than political. They were personal. We can't call this health policy when it kills the poor. That wasn't a soundbite. It was a wound turned inside out. And when she added, liberal ideals can't survive if they're built on the bodies of black and brown people, it wasn't theory. It was testimony. You could almost feel the air shift. Like a courtroom gavel hit something deeper than wood. It struck conscience. The public response wasn't just emotional, it was transformative. Teachers printed her quotes and taped them to their classroom walls. College students named study groups after her. Mothers whispered her name into their children's ears at bedtime, not as a politician, but as a new kind of hero. In barber shops, churches, union halls, and late-night buses, people weren't just talking about Jasmine. They were talking about justice, and that conversation had teeth. Even in places where her name had never been spoken, the impact was undeniable. State lawmakers started revisiting Medicaid policies. School districts launched open forums on systemic inequality in health access. Small towns began holding town halls that didn't just check a box, they tore it open. Because this wasn't just about what happened in that chamber. It was about what had been happening for decades, in silence, behind bureaucratic doors and under the weight of indifference. Jasmine didn't call herself a symbol. She never asked for that burden, but people gave it to her anyway. Not because she asked, but because she earned it. She didn't scream. She didn't grandstand. She asked questions no one wanted to answer. And when the silence got too loud, she filled it with truth. This case didn't offer easy villains or simple endings. Kennedy didn't vanish. The victims' families didn't get closure wrapped in ribbons. But that's what made it real. And that's what made it matter. The message was never, justice has been done. The message was, justice starts when we stop pretending things are fine. Jasmine showed us something else too. Something we often forget. That courage doesn't always look like a raised fist. Sometimes it's a calm voice in a shaking room. Sometimes it's a woman refusing to sit down when told, you're out of line. Sometimes it's a question asked not for applause, but because the answer has been buried too long. And here's the truth that struck deepest. Systems don't change because they're caught. They change when they can no longer look away. Jasmine didn't just catch the system, she made it stare into its own reflection. And that reflection was ugly. It was soaked in inequality, stained by silence, and bloated with excuses. But it was also a starting point. One of the most powerful signs was held by a woman at a protest in Atlanta. It didn't say justice now or resign Kennedy. It said, if we don't fight for the next mother's child, who will fight for mine? That's what Jasmine ignited. Not outrage for clicks, but ownership for change. And when asked later what kept her going, Jasmine said something simple. I just kept thinking, if I don't speak, who will? That line hit harder than any speech, because it wasn't rehearsed, it was raw. And maybe that's the lesson at the heart of it all. We don't need perfect heroes. We need imperfect people who refuse to stay silent. We don't need polished slogans. We need voices that shake when they speak, and speak anyway. This story wasn't about winning, it was about waking up. In the months that followed, the hearings slowed, the headlines faded, and the dust settled. But something had shifted. It wasn't just that the nation had witnessed a confrontation. It was that they had felt it. They had seen the curtain pulled back. And once you see how the machine works, you can't unsee it. Jasmine Crockett reminded America of something dangerous and necessary. That silence protects power. And speech, real speech, can tear that protection to shreds. She reminded us that justice doesn't come from viral moments. It comes from persistence, from asking hard questions, from refusing to let go of the truth, even when the world begs you to move on. And most of all, she reminded us that every system has a crack, and sometimes all it takes is one voice, steady and unyielding, to break it wide open. But lessons mean nothing if they stay locked in speeches. They only matter when people act. The moment demanded more than reflection. It demanded movement. Jasmine's words were not meant to sit in newspapers or hang on protest signs forever. They were meant to be carried into the streets, into schools, into courtrooms, and into living rooms. She said it plainly in front of a restless crowd. If we walk away now, they'll do it again. If we stay silent, they'll bury the truth with us. The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in a collective vow that silence would no longer be the easy choice. Action was no longer abstract. It was immediate, tangible, and urgent. Jasmine called for watchdog groups in every state, ordinary people stepping up to monitor policies and demand records. She urged students to dig into history, to uncover what else had been hidden in plain sight. She pressed communities to hold town halls not once, but monthly to keep leaders under the glare of scrutiny. Don't wait for permission, she warned. Start the fight where you stand. And people did. Petitions spread, legal funds grew, and the movement took a shape larger than any one politician. She reminded America that change is not given, it is taken. No system surrenders its power willingly. You have to drag it out into the light and make it answer. Her words cut through the air like a blade, slicing past excuses and fatigue. Every person in that crowd felt the charge. It wasn't about left or right anymore. It was about survival, dignity, and the refusal to let the vulnerable be sacrificed again. The call was simple. Get louder, get organized, and get unshakable. And so the call to action thundered across the nation. Jasmine's voice became a spark, but it was the people who had to build the fire. And in that fire, the choice became clear for everyone watching. Act now, or be complicit in silence. Stand up, she said, her voice steady, because justice only lives if you breathe life into it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.